Hello everyone, this is Noor Mousa.
And this is Rachel Sider.
Welcome to Confused About Syria. Confused About Syria is a 5-episode series talking about two aid workers' experience working in Syria and trying to make sense of recent events and their future implications.
So today in episode 3, we are reflecting on what took place on the 8th of December, 2024, when after a decade or more of protracted conflict where we saw just tremendous human suffering, mass displacement on a global scale, and the destruction of entire cities in Syria, we saw Syria propelled back into some of the global headlines when a large-scale offensive took place in late November and early December 2024, which resulted in rebel and armed groups entering Damascus and pushing Bashar al-Assad out of the country and ending what was more than 50 years of Ba'athist party control in the country. And listeners may remember that this was really a moment for some that presented the possibility of seeing an end to this very long, brutal chapter of civil war for Syria. And that for others, this was a event that prompted urgent, really life or death consequences and questions about safety, about rule of law and justice, about well-being and trust in governance amidst a huge amount of uncertainty. And that in the span of just a couple of days, a lot of these questions were really brought to the fore. And I hope that we can dig into this together, Noor, to really understand how the collapse of the Assad government unfolded, how Syrians and you, having been in Damascus, experienced it yourselves, and what some of those reactions and feelings and levels of understanding that differed across the country and among different groups in the population, what that might mean for the future for Syrians and for the country itself.
Thanks, Rachel. For me, I first arrived to Syria in September 2024 and then noticed the sanctions and their impact and was just trying to pick up on the role and the advocacy work on Syria. And end of October, next month, end of October, Israel started to attack south of Lebanon. So you had large waves of Syrians with no other alternative other than going back to Syria, going to different parts of Syria to escape that Israeli attack on south of Lebanon. And many Lebanese also crossed. At the time, Israel was attacking senior Hezbollah leaders. And they were not only attacking them in Lebanon, they also were attacking them in Damascus in Syria. I was in Damascus and I was witnessing these attacks. It happened multiple times. The neighborhood I was based in is the most attacked neighborhood. There was once I was in the office, another time I was walking towards the guest house where everybody in the street stopped. We heard the explosion, the attack. We stopped and then we continued with life. Another time it happened near a hotel near my guest house and continued to happen multiple times. They were targeted attacks, but you never knew when they were happening. And we were told, don't worry, you're not targeted, but we don't know where they could happen and at what time. So it's just everybody was worried. So even before December happened, started with Aleppo and then the taking over of the whole Syria, in Damascus, people in Damascus were already experiencing a start of, they've already lived for many years under attacks, but that time I was new to the country, but then also other colleagues who were there before me were feeling that things were escalating. And nobody actually at that time thought that Hezbollah being attacked that much could impact Syria. Nobody was thinking about Syria other than Israel is attacking Hezbollah. We're thinking maybe the Syrian government would attack Idlib and take some parts of it. The M5, that was a big discussion, taking part of the M5, but it wasn't expected. So in Damascus at the time, everybody was concerned about what is happening with Lebanon and Israel in Gaza and how Syria is being impacted. Nobody's saying anything about Israeli attacks on Syria other than reporting them in the news, not saying that this is a violation. The Syrian government made few statements, but we were just having to deal with it, not knowing when it happens. And as I said before, Syrians in Damascus and the parts under the former government control were struggling with economy, The Syrians I met when I first arrived to Syria were telling me that now more than ever they were thinking about leaving the country. And many were actually trying to find ways to leave the country because of the economy, because how censored they were on even very simple things, like not even political. Everybody was self-censoring. I remember also before going to Syria, a friend told me, no, just be aware. Not everything you told take for granted, because sometimes people can not really expose the reality or just not tell you the full story because people are paranoid. And I say this at the time, I'm not really believing it. But then later on, I started to discover that, oh, nobody told me this. Nobody told me that when I asked about this. And just that tells me that I really didn't understand the Syrian mentality at the time and how people were actually under so much pressure. And they were probably paranoid because of all of this surveillance and what happened. Their experience is heavy. So at that time, nobody expected December 8th. It was mainly concerns from Israel and what is happening in Lebanon and in Gaza.
And I think that's the thing with a moment like this, right? We can sit here now and we can look at this one day in Syria's history and describe it with a level of coherence and can certainly explain how it came about. But in the days and weeks leading up to the December 8th rupture, it was difficult to see where this was heading, right? And even in the weeks after Bashar al-Assad fled the country, there was still a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And I remember sitting in Geneva at the time, following international news sources who were describing this quote unquote lightning offensive by rebel and armed groups, in Aleppo, in Homs, eventually reaching Damascus, and hearing reports of seizures of government infrastructure of some of these major urban centers and getting a sense that something was afoot, but not with the level of urgency and consequence, I think, that was required, because it took a while to reach those of us who were a bit farther away. And I'd just be curious to know, what was the mood then on the ground then as things started to evolve much more quickly, as forces started to make headway in some of the areas also where the organization you were working for was operating and where colleagues were living? And what did that mean then for how Syrians were beginning to process the events in real time?
Trying to unpack what was happening, it's really interesting for me now, because it started with Hayat Tahrir Sham HTS advancing to Aleppo, and you had two groups. Like you had two different opinions. One opinion was this is a designated group, these are Islamic group, this might not be good for the people in Aleppo, it's not safe, and that's mainly in the government control areas and in some Western media as well, because Hayat Tahrir Sham is a designated group. You have another group that was completely silent, didn't say anything. You're just observing what is happening. And then I later on knew why they were silent. When Hayat Tahrir Sham started taking over Aleppo, and at that time Russia attacked them and attacked Aleppo neighborhood. It wasn't safe. And the first few days we were contacting our staff to check on them. It wasn't easy for them. Power cuts, water cuts, inability to go to the market. Again, many of them were silent. Some of them decided to leave Aleppo with their families, and those who left were mainly from minority groups who are from that first group, who thought these are extremist groups, things might not be safe for us. Later on, when Hayat Tahrir Sham was advancing to Hama, we started to hear from Aleppo staff that things are great. There's gas, we have a new telecommunication company, we have internet, things are better, it's completely safe. Completely safe. And it was very interesting because the more Hayat Tahrir Sham, the more HTS advanced to the south, the people who we were already concerned about, we were concerned about their safety, were doing better. And then Homs. And then I discovered later on that why we had this large group silence, because they wanted that. Because they wanted Bashar al-Assad out. They wanted to be liberated. And that's when I just felt a bit stupid. I just not realizing that earlier, that many people, Aleppo was under the control of rebel groups for a long time. And then the Syrian government took it, as you were saying before recording, you told me that you were there at that time. And it was difficult time for the communities there because it was full-on conflict. And then now gaining back control just getting rid of Bashar al-Assad control over their areas. Many of them wanted this and welcomed it, celebrated it. So it was really, really interesting that the more they advanced, we started getting better news from the people who were liberated at that time, according to what they described. So when I was in Damascus, though, during that time, things were rapidly escalating. You started to see less people going to the street. There's this food delivery app that everybody uses in Damascus, Be Order, that stopped delivering and just saying connection issue. So, and at that time I was working almost 24. It just was a crisis mood, but we didn't know what was happening. It's a humanitarian development, but at the same time, we have staff we wanted to check on and care for. And we wanted to also know what is going to happen in the country and how we protect ourselves. It was very challenging, but Damascus became very quiet. People started to go out less. Many men who paid to not be in the army were hiding themselves, including people I knew. And the mood was very low, very depressing. You see people crying here and there when you walk around, fearing for unknown future. And at some point, I had a mental collapse because I felt that, let's just keep in mind that I'm an Iraqi in Syria. I experience enough conflict in my own country, but I have not experienced it as an outsider, seeing how others are going through it. So just seeing the faces of people being terrified, not wanting Hayat Tahrir Sham or whatever, not wanting liberation. No, they were terrified because they didn't know how things will evolve. And everybody, I think it's valid concern for many people. So I experienced 2003 and I experienced 2014 ISIS and the US invasion of Iraq. And at one point I felt that I was experiencing both at the same time. Just seeing the faces of the Syrians around me, feeling that their regime is under major threat. But it's a regime that you also don't really agree with. Like you live under its control, but you don't really fully agree with. At the same time, you're worried that this group who is advancing, and there are other armed groups in the country, have been linked to extremist behavior, and many of them are designated as terrorist groups, so you are concerned also for your own safety. So I would say it must have been very challenging for many people, and they all had valid reasons, but for me it was unexpected. My behavior, my reaction towards it was unexpected because I didn't see myself as a traumatized Iraqi. That experience made me realize that I'm actually traumatized by what happened in my country, because seeing other people going through it, it made me realize it's not something that you just can flip a page and continue living. And this is what we usually do in this part of the world. It's just something happened, something major happened. It's just like, okay, we continue living. But at some moment, something would happen and remind you of the heaviness of that experience.
The fear and almost the emotional exhaustion that you're describing of this moment, I think, is something that was certainly echoed among the Syrian friends and colleagues who I was checking in on in this time. I think many can maybe relate to this, which was even the challenge of knowing what to say and how to be there and to provide support and maybe allyship in a moment like this was very challenging because of the level of uncertainty that you're describing and because of the diversity of views, right, around how people perceive and react and anticipate the consequences of this offensive and ultimately the fall of the Assad government. And I think also a lot of the fear, right, stems from who was involved in this offensive in the first place, right? And Hayat Tahrir Sham being really the driving armed group in this scenario. But of course, this was a ragtag bunch of dozens of groups with a range of allegiances and capabilities and ideologies, right? And I think it's just worth pausing on that for a second because HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, which had been established in 2017, having merged from a number of other rebel factions in the northwest part of Syria, was branded as a terrorist organization and labeled one by the United States. Its leader himself, al-Shara, having been sanctioned, and their ideology and their formal ties, even with al-Qaeda, I think brought certainly a certain reputation that certainly contributed to the fear that many had about not only how it would conduct itself in the military operations. We did see civilian casualties, destruction of civilian property in the offensive itself. There's also the history of how it had governed under the Salvation government in the northwest part of Syria, in Idlib and parts of rural Aleppo, and some of the human rights practices that it had espoused as part of that governance scheme. And so that in and of itself is worth reflecting on also as we try to understand really how this offensive took shape. What were some of the factors that both led HTS to undertake successfully the military operation, but also what gave way among government forces and government capabilities to enable them to move so rapidly as they did?
I think that's a very important question, and because we knew that Hayat Tahrir Sham didn't expect this happening, and they didn't do it alone. Groups joined in later on, so that was also the support by other groups that enabled uh, maybe it wouldn't happen eventually by Hayat Tahrir Sham alone, but speed up the process, but maybe also enabled it to actually happen. It's not really clear yet because we never knew how things would evolve in Syria. But the Syrian army is also part of it. It was weak army, poorly invested in because of the lack of resources, but then also the morale of the fighters is very low. It's just people were, these are Syrian citizens who know what was happening in their country. They were going also through this civil conflict. Many of them had different reasons to be in the army, and probably some of them didn't want to be in the army. We know that their meals were not very nutritional. They weren't paid well. So corruption was something you hear about. Corruption is like having to pay bribes to different security actors in Syria to go around and do different things. So the morale was low, the investment was low. At that moment, Hezbollah was almost not in Syria, not really supporting other groups as well. And it was only Russia at the time. It was interesting what was happening in December. Around that time, the Doha Forum was happening, and we were monitoring. So it's like, what is happening in Doha? And then you started to see this country coming and saying what is happening in Syria is a Syrian matter. And then another country, and then Iran saying what is happening in Syria is a Syrian matter, and then Russia saying it. So you start to realize that things are changing politically. There is a political decision on Syria somehow, that there is an agreement that things should change, that we cannot sustain the status quo. And probably that helped a lot. That was a big factor of it, that somehow there was an agreement. We don't know how the agreement happened, what were the consequences, what are actually the consequences of it, who decided to give what in exchange of what. Probably that conversation happened. But it was the first time, I think, we saw an agreement that what is happening in Syria is a Syrian matter. It was just very interesting, the agreement on that language. So it was fully Syrians taking over other Syrian parts and Syrians withdrawing. It was fully internal. No external power was part of it, other than supporting different parts of the conflict for many years before. Me, what was interesting at that time and what made me realize the danger of talking about Syria is rumors. Rumors is spreading. And it made me also realize that I might not actually know facts about a situation, but I might actually never know the full facts, or maybe there is never a fact, you never can understand the full truth about something in Syria because of these rumors. So within few days only, there were the rumors that the Russians assassinated Ahmad al-Shara, at the time called Julani. It was a rumor that the 4th Division, the largest Syrian government army group, fought the Syrian army. So they had a coup. There was a coup happening in Damascus. And then Bashar al-Assad was assassinated. So all these things were happening. It's just like you hear this rumor and that rumor that actually Hezbollah is coming, and Russia will join in, and then this is happening and that is happening, and ISIS will take over, and ISIS is part of this. All these rumors. Just, I think in Syria, Telegram is really active. People like Syrians are active users on Telegram. So I created a Telegram account with my Syrian number, enjoyed these different groups, and it just got crazy within a few hours because of all of these rumors and propaganda. And another thing is, there are two elements that don't help you as someone who's there to help people, who just wants to understand, to help. It doesn't help me that there are all these rumors, but also it doesn't help me that most of the materials I was getting were from Western media, the media that designated Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, support the countries that imposed illegal sanctions on Syria because they weren't UN sanctions, they were US and EU sanctions. You know, that section by itself is a complicated subject on Syria. So I was mainly fed information from certain media outlets, not only Western, sometimes Arabs, who had alliances with different actors. So I wasn't able to understand what was happening through media as well, even when you circulate. There's also half truth everywhere. And the third one is Syrians censoring themselves. So the majorities of staff who decided to stay in Aleppo, they didn't tell us why. I didn't ask, I didn't think. But also they didn't tell us that this is something they were looking forward to. They still, to this moment, they are not sharing their concerns because as like, let's wait to see, maybe it's not safe for us to talk. So these don't help you when you want to understand Syria. I feel like I would never be able to understand because I just have to play mind games with different people, try to connect everything. And you need to be a researcher to work on Syria. Otherwise, you just fell into traps, as I'm sure I have on different issues and different labelings and terminologies because of all of these factors. But yeah, I was just wanted to bring it back to rumors and the danger of rumors. That for me, that was what escalated the situation for me and made me want to leave. Not only the fear that of the unknown, but also the rumors that made me decide on the 6th of December to leave Syria. I was the first staff among our team to decide to leave Syria. And that was mainly it for me.
To imagine that also being exposed to so many rumors and trying to make sense of what was happening on the ground didn't just affect you on a personal level to make some very difficult decisions about whether you stayed or you left the country, but also made it very difficult for humanitarian organizations to position and respond to some of these events by continuing to stay and deliver and provide humanitarian aid where it was possible, especially as new needs are being generated, and simultaneously, as you've mentioned, to look after staff and to ensure staff safety and well-being during this really tumultuous period. And this reminds me so much of other periods of time in Syria's conflict history where there were very large-scale military offensives that were conducted by Syrian government forces to retake areas that had been held by rebel and armed groups. And it's just really striking to see how different those scenarios were from the one that we're describing leading up to the 8th of December. Because in many of those moments, especially in 2018, when so many of us were trying to reach and access and provide services in besieged and hard to reach areas, the level of human suffering, of acute malnourishment and devastation to the civilian population, high levels of displacement in that period was so difficult to respond to given the scale of the need, but also the heaviness of the bombardment and the challenges of navigating really active conflict, but also the difficulties that staff had to process and also to make sense of what was happening in real time. And I think there's real similarities there when it comes to trying to parse out what's really going on minute to minute in an active conflict situation, but also to make good decisions when you don't have perfect information. And so that really resonates for me, Noor. And I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about how Syrians today and in the moments after the 8th of December, when the news broke that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham had taken, that Bashar al-Assad had fled the country, that some of these real monumental shifts, once they were confirmed, what did that mean? What were some of the responses, and how were you also processing that yourself?
I'll start with the when I decided to leave and why I decided to leave, and I decided to leave on the night of the 5th of December. Actually, 12 a.m., so almost the 6th of December. Because on that day, I saw so many people crying and fear. I saw the fear in their eyes, and I just felt I can't do anything. I just felt helpless. There's nothing I can do. I understand I'm a humanitarian, I'm an advocacy person. I just felt I won't be able to help when I am in that situation, in the similar situation. When I left on the 6th, just 2 hours after, I was still in the Jordanian border when the Syrian border fell. When I managed, after 6 hours being on the border, reach a hotel, I checked my phone. We were checking this live map to see the advancement. This live map was also another stress factor for me because it just kept updating and this thing was crazy. And it also spread rumors. Sometimes it's just the news, sometimes is just from a Twitter account and you don't know if it's factual or not. So I checked and it's like the whole south became green. They used the green for the rebels and red for the former Syrian government. And just before I left, it was all red. And I remember when I was on the border, the Syrian side before crossing, the intelligence officer, he told me, you just came back to Syria 2 weeks ago. Why are you leaving? And I told him, my mother told me so. Because she did tell me, Noor, I don't feel comfortable you staying there. And there were many Iraqis of us on the border. So it seems like we all had the same feeling. And he's like, okay, but I really left because I kept thinking of the few faces, 3 faces, mainly 3 faces. A face of a colleague who was just crying. We used to have these daily meetings with staff to check on them. And her face was like extremely worried. She was about to cry. And me thinking how many times she had went through this. And she's a young woman, you know, just because she's a Syrian. And then another face was of a young man stopping a taxi to go join the military. And you can see on his face that he doesn't want to do this. He's forced. He's terrified. And another face is just a face of also another colleague who had a child. And it's just, you know, it was very scary. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so I kept thinking about this and I'm just decided for my own sanity and for also safety, let me just leave and then come back when things become better. So when I left, unfortunately, I stopped being in Syria. So I didn't really know what was happening on the 6th, 7th, and the 8th. I wasn't there, but I was in Jordan, surrounded by Jordanians. And that's important part of it as well, because Jordanians were looking forward to that moment. They were feeling that Syria was a second home to them. And for many years now, it became unreachable for them. So while they were monitoring the situation, they cared about what was happening in Syria. And I had other Syrian friends in Jordan. They were from a certain minority, so not really fully representative, but they were from the same city I was in with the same community. So I saw how concerned they were. We were just monitoring the life map all the time. The first thing is on the 8th of December morning, you see the 2 main news. One, Bashar al-Assad, 6 a.m., fled the country. The airplane on Hamas disappeared. And you feel like he didn't, actually, he just left everyone behind. He left the army that he mobilized. He left the country. He left Damascus. He left people just like, you deal with it. Or you don't know. Did he do this for people to deal with it? Or he wanted it to be peaceful? People were debating that. Did he actually had any intentions for Syrian people, or was it just mainly personal decision, come from personal motives, not care for Syria and not having a bloody fight around Damascus? So you see people just like did he play us all this time, 14 years? We are fighting and he could just have done this, just took a flight and left. The other thing is many people was like were relieved because it wasn't bloody. They didn't have to go through a war, conflict, and it wasn't what it was expected, that Damascus going to be surrounded by the army, the Syrian army, and there would be clashes and people would be trapped inside. That didn't happen. The groups from the south went toward Damascus even before Hayat Tahrir Sham reached Damascus. So it just happened very quickly for people. It was peaceful a bit, because when you hear from Syrians that for a few days, not even 3, maybe a full week, there were gunfire celebrations of the takeover of Syria. Israel was attacking military facilities, heavily attacking military facilities. People weren't able to sleep. There were and some areas people felt that the earth was shaking, and there were shortages of chemical weapons that were attacked, and people were worried about the air they were breathing for days. So I would say these two main things. It's just the celebrations, gunshots, and the mosques, and the calling around, and the most people were hearing these sounds, and the Israeli attacks. I wasn't there to witness it, but that's what I heard from my colleagues and my friends. It wasn't easy. Some people were concerned for their safety, especially from minority groups, that they started to lock themselves in. They didn't know if those are extremist group and are going to kill us and stuff like that. People were really concerned. And then the statement happened. It's like, we are here to live with each other. We are not going to seek revenge. This is a new Syria. So there was a sense of relief that, okay, this is a new chapter. Let's try to see how it's going to write itself or be written by these new players. So I would say it was very tense time for the people who stayed there. For me, I was in Amman, surrounded by Jordanians who were very happy, distributing kunafa and just super excited that they will be able to go back to Syria and have lunch and buy sweets and buy breakfast. It's a bit superficial, but it's deeper than this. It's a connection of people to another country that they lost for a long time, and they were excited to be able to get back. And I was happy for them, but what mattered for me the whole time is Syrians and my friends inside who were terrified still. Because again, it's not easy to live under that, all of that, like attacks from Israel and the gunshots and not knowing what is going to happen, not really even sure who is taking control over the country, because yes, it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but there are all these other groups, and what are their motives, how they are playing with each other, are they actually coordinating? I remember hearing it from many of my colleagues is, yes, maybe Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is coming with the intention not to fight everyone and to create some stability, but can we trust the other groups? So that was a concern for many people as well.
It's hard not to also notice the discrepancies between what this was and what we saw in terms of aspirations and values in some of the early days of the protest movement in 2011 and the revolutionary spirit that really infused the movement at the time around dignity, as we discussed in the last episode, freedom and the pursuit of broader democratic values, and how in many ways this dramatic change in the political situation didn't look anything like that mass mobilization and public mobilization that we're so familiar of and which we covered in the last episode, but yet had the potential to usher in significant levels of change nonetheless. And I think what's also really powerful in what you've shared, Noor, is that because this caught so many off guard in the country, because also of the role of regional powers, as you've described in the context of the Doha Forum, enabling and almost facilitating or not taking certain actions that would allow these changes to occur, that equally those within the broader international community, and particularly the West, were profoundly caught off guard by what was taking place. And I think something that they're still struggling with is that many of the assumptions on which the international community, whether it's the United Nations or individual member states, the US, the UK, and other big donor governments to the aid response in particular, had not cast this scenario in many of their own plans. And so what we saw in that moment, too, was a degree of shock and a bit of an uncertainty as to how to respond to some of those early events politically, but also in terms of an injection of humanitarian aid and additional support that was required. And I think now those challenges are still present in terms of what it means for the international community to support longer-term recovery and reconstruction when the entire machine of supporting Syria diplomatically and through development had certain inertia in a different direction, right? And the switching of those gears is something that I've certainly picked up on in my own brain, because I never allowed myself as a professional and as someone who's really committed to Syria to even foresee a scenario in which this could occur, but also equally to be part of a system that had assumed that we would see an entrenched Assad government for much longer. And so I think we're still dealing with some of the consequences of what I've just described.
Yes, and I remembered also another thing that was a big concern for many Syrians at that time was looting. Individuals who use that opportunity um, to rob other people, a government institution, banks. So that was another safety concern for Syrians. And one key criticism of what happened around that time is the opening of prisons and liberating prisoners, but at the same time, loss of evidence that are really essential for the next phase of justice and transitional justice for many Syrians are really deserving and craving for. These were also two other elements that the international community as well is monitoring and could be part of. And some organizations were criticized for not playing a role in that. But the situation was really rapidly evolving, and the sense of safety was questioned for many people. I was really confused because I saw so many journalists, young journalists, just crossing the borders, going to Syria on the 8th of December. And I was so happy to see many people I knew from Iraq who were coming to Erbil, where I was living, and just reporting on the conflict in Mosul, but then also in Raqqa, who were able to, was like, finally, we are in Syria, we are going to document these events. But at the same time, NGOs being a bit careful with the situation because of safety, and not only NGOs, but then actors who are needed at that time, who just were unsure about the situation. So I was a bit, it wasn't very clear for me what was happening in Syria. And I think for many Syrians, it wasn't clear. You see all these armed men, and we have to be fair for those who were stuck for many years under al-Assad regime. They are used to certain security actors to be in a certain way, and they are seeing them in a completely different way now. And they associate them to the enemy before. That's something that person needs to adjust to. And at that time, I was hearing from many Syrians that we are fearing for our lives from these new security players because the beards, the masks, they are young, they are dressed in this way. As an outsider, I was like, I don't want to say anything now because I know that this takes time to get used to and things will change. But that was also another factor, is people were quick to judge. And it's understandable, but at the same time, they were quick to judge, but at the same time, there's a valid explanation to it, that it takes time. This is something that they are not used to. So people not trusting the new security actors, some people seizing the opportunity to loot, and others who are craving, and others who wanted to liberate those in prisons, took actions, individual actions. So as outsiders, you monitor what is happening in Syria, and it's like, it's a mess. It's a mess. How can we actually be systematic and respond amidst all of that? So I understand some of the delays and some of reluctantness to respond at that time.
Perhaps this resonates with your experience, Noor, in Iraq, but something that was quite striking to me in both the events that played out leading up to December 8th, as well as the challenges that Syria is continuing to grapple with, is both the difficulties and mixed experiences of those who were mobilized to participate and to be combatants in this conflict, who were mobilized across all walks of life, whether through forced conscription policies or for other reasons, feeling of needing to provide for one's family, so many different motivations for partaking in violence, and both how that translates in terms of the levels of safety and fear that people feel today, but also the challenges that poses to certain subsets of the population and the genderedness of those experiences, men who were involved in conflict and their experience in the offensive, in the war that preceded it, and in the future of Syria's recovery. And I wonder if you have reflections along those lines.
One thing I worry about in Syria is replicating what happened in Iraq. And somehow it is being replicated. Some of the decisions understandable, but we all know in Iraq the de-Baathification and the dissolution of the Iraqi army has been criticized as decisions were unsensitive to Iraq context, and somehow later on contributed to grievances and escalations and resurgence of ISIS. And we know the story from Iraq. But I also care about the human experience of it. I think many of us have someone in our family is in the army. I personally had my father in the Iraqi army. Fortunately, he left the army before 2003. And we understand sometimes the people in our family who are part of the army, either because they want to protect their country and they have strong nationalistic values, or in many cases, purely economical reasons. It's much easier. You don't have to study much. You train, you get resources, you get supported, and it's in an honorable sector to join. And sometimes out of need, your contacts need you to fight for it. So you do it. And I think in Syria, we can find all of that. So my concern is many of us, I think for Syrian it might be a bit different, but a Syrian friend told me that many Syrians look at their own situation and they don't really think about the other's situation. That's something I will reflect in a bit. But from my point of view, this is the same in Syria. It's just you have people who join the Syrian army with al-Assad for these different reasons. Is either they believe or out of care or fear, or they need the resources, or there is no alternative and they want to do it to protect their own people. So we really need to look at them as individuals. There are ones who engaged in war crimes and there are processes to deal with that. And there are ones who are victims. Like in Iraq, many of them were. Iraq was led by Saddam Hussein, who engaged in multiple wars. He wanted a strong army. So many young Iraqi men had that opportunity because of the lack of other opportunities. So this is something we have to keep in mind. In Syria, going through a war for 14 years, the Syrian army definitely recruited many people because not that people wanted to be in the army only, but because the lack of other opportunities and the way the government framed it and the situation enabled it. So I worry a lot about grievances on individuals who were in the former armies and being translated to violence against them on unlawful treatment, vetting, and I fear that similar consequences might be seen in Syria. And I really hope that the lesson is learned from Iraq and not really look at it as a one unit, one Syrian, one Iraq army, one Syrian army, but as individuals, their cases, their stories. These are people part of the community, their families are part of the communities. There are widows, there are orphans whose father died on the front line, their father was on this part or that part. These are still widows and orphans that the government and the system needs to take care of. So I really hope that the new Syrian government consider that helping those individuals who lost someone in any part of that conflict, because this is how you build unity and you build a new state. So my concern is that in Syria, similar thing happened to Iraq, is that you start only looking at the army by itself or a certain group by itself and not looking at the individual stories, the consequences for these decisions, and disregarding their experience and not thinking of the future and how this could impact your future. And I'm not only saying this about the Syrian army, I'm also saying that for different rebel groups and different armed groups who had different reasons to be part of these groups that like sometimes it's a matter of survival for many of them, fight of survival of their families, and they had to do it. You knowing the army or armed person in a certain figure, in a certain way, presenting themselves in a certain way, and seeing these people, these other groups in a different way, does not take away from what they are contributing, what they are doing. If they are beards, they are wearing masks, and they are not shaving, that does not enable you in any way to judge them differently. So my concern is that might translate into lack of trust and ability and willingness to collaborate with that security actor who it might take them time to build their systems and organize themselves. Oh, that might be the new way they do things and you need to influence it. But choosing, and that's the main message here, I think, choosing also to be a passive citizen, deciding just to observe how things go and developing your own positions and interacting in your own way without being part of the change, because this is a new chapter. Deciding just to read it and not be part of writing it will give you a lesson to learn. The people next door already learned that lesson, so you don't really need to go through this yourself. It's just us in Iraq, we learned that lesson. Many of the Iraqis who chose not to be part of the new Iraq after 2003, struggled and their communities struggled. So that would be my message for the Syrians. Listen to that. You have to be active. You have to be part of this. That's the only way for the new Syria to be inclusive of everyone.
In addition to what you've just described, Noor, I think there are a couple of other powerful takeaways from today's episode. The first is about the centrality of trust and really the impact that the lack of trust people had led to rumors, misinformation, and a tremendous amount of fear and uncertainty, which made dealing with and coping with news about the events leading up to and surrounding the 8th of December all the more challenging, and how significant of an effort this will require to both restore trust within and across Syrian civil society amongst one another, but also to have trust in and ensure the trustworthiness of this new administration, which has to prove itself, right? And not only because of how it emerged from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a Islamic militant group, but also because it is trying to appeal to a very divided and diverse society. And I think that's really the second point here is that element of diversity of Syria that continues to come through both in how people experienced this dramatic political rupture in the trajectory of the conflict and in Syria's history, and how different perceptions and reactions to the change in government are continuing to be felt, and Syrians therefore have a choice about how that diversity continues to be treasured and hopefully allows for greater reconciliation and the building of a future Syria that is more inclusive and honor some of the values that were really sought in the early days of the protest movement in 2011. And as we look ahead, both of these elements, in addition to what you described around the reconciliation that needs to happen with those who participated in the conflict themselves and the victims of the conflict, are really going to shape the terms of Syria's recovery and its ability to reach higher levels of stability and peace over the longer term.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this. And I think with that, we can end today's episode. And for the next episode, we will be talking about the transition and what shaped the living experience of Syrians up to today. So thank you for listening. And please make sure to check the notes of this episode.